I want to let you in on a secret. There's a new really good strategy in Siege that a lot of people haven't caught on to yet. It's called diving. What is diving? Well, I'll let you know. Let's get into it. Alright, now actually last video I kind of touched on this strategy, but honestly last video was more like a discovery of the strategy, and this video is going to be a complete in-depth guide on it. I've played a lot with this strategy versus top players, and I've really figured it out and how to do it. It's called diving. What is diving? Diving is when you make a dive, a really strong push on the enemy Ike, the enemy safe, without a robot. This is actually, potentially, if you do it right, a really strong strategy that you need to know how to do, when to do it, and how to defend against it. Now, I want to teach you all the ins and outs, all the keys of this strategy, something that you definitely need to know if you want to become good at Siege. If you like these sort of videos, definitely subscribe so I can make more of these videos for you all. Now, there's some really important things with diving that you have to know that I'm going to go over. First of all, when is a good time to dive? How often do you want to dive? What sort of effect does diving have on the enemy? How viable is this really? Is it going to be used in competitive play? What are the best brawlers for it? How to stop dive, and more. I'm going to go over all of that. Also, I'm going to show you some gameplay of me facing off versus other top players, and I'm going to show some wins as well as some losses so you can get an understanding of when this strategy works and when it can kind of struggle. Let's start out with what diving is and why it's so strong. First of all, diving is when you make a push on the enemy Ike without a robo. Now, the key to this is you want to do it while it's undefended. Why is this so strong? Because you can actually get over 50% damage on the enemy Ike safe by yourself without a robot. You can easily do even more if you have a super strong push on it. Now, this is why it's such a strong strategy. Obviously, that's a really high amount of damage on the enemy Ike turret, and being able to do it without a robot supporting you is insane and makes this a really strong strategy. So you have to know how to do it. You have to know how to defend against it. A dive is usually done with at least 2 people. A solo dive can work, but that's usually preferable for just finishing off games. You usually want at least 2 people when you make a dive on the enemy safe. 3 is of course better, but harder to do and maybe more unrealistic. One of the most important things to know with diving is when you should make a dive on the enemy safe. Now, the most important thing for that is the positioning of the enemy. First of all, you want to make sure there's no enemies respawning. The most important thing, make sure there's no enemies within the semicircle around the Ike. Now, just because they're not within it doesn't mean that they can't defend it. So the goal with this is you want to make a dive on the enemy Ike when they're not able to defend it well, when they're more forward on the map. If they're not able to get back in time to defend it, that's when you can, of course, do the most damage. If they're able to defend it, you're gonna die a lot quicker and you're not gonna deal nearly as much damage. You don't want to make dives on the enemy safe if they can defend it. If they can defend it, you're not going to get value, you're going to lose control of the map, and it's just not going to be worth it. So first of all, make sure no one is within that red semicircle on their safe. Also, make sure that there's hopefully not people nearby the semicircle that can quickly come back and defend against the MiG. If those conditions are met, then you can go in and make a dive on the enemy safe. But there's one other thing you have to keep in mind, and that's the next siege. How much time is left on that siege counter? First of all, if you are gonna win that siege and there's 10 seconds or under on that clock, do not make a dive in. And why do I say this? Because you're going to give up control and you will have a robot supporting you. Of course, you can make a push without the robo, and that's good to get that damage whenever you can. But if you're about to have a robo, you may as well wait for it to spawn, because you're going to make a stronger push with a robo regardless. Yeah, it's nice to get that damage when you can without the robot, but if you can make a stronger push, always make the stronger push, and you're going to have the stronger push with the robo. So if there's 10 seconds or under, wait for that robot to spawn with you, and then go with that and make a bigger push then. The enemy robot is about to spawn, that's fine, you can make that push in, but it's probably better not to, because you're going to spawn all the way back by your safe, and then it's going to be harder to stop that enemy robot. But the exception is, if you want to make a dive on the enemy safe in order to be closer to your safe so you can kill the robot faster, that makes sense, do it then. But how often should you be making a dive throughout the game? When you make dives, it can tend to give up a little bit of control to the enemy because of course you're going and suiciding on the enemy safe and you have to respawn and then march up back the field. So how often should you be going? Because of course you want to get as much damage as possible, but you also don't want to give the enemy too much control over the map, giving them too many bolts, getting too many robots and too strong of robots. So you really only want to be making dives 1 or 2 times throughout the game. It's going to depend though on how much damage you get on those pushes. Going in once is definitely fine. The second time is when you really need to think about it. If you know you can get a strong push on that second one, definitely go in. But if you don't get a strong push on that second one, you might end up giving up too much control. If you go in 2 times and after the second time that enemy safe is not at around 10% health left, then you're probably in a lot of trouble because you gave up a lot of control, suiciding multiple times, and that enemy probably is going to get around 3 robots, and if the enemy gets 3 robots on you, that's usually way too hard to defend against. That's just too much to take. So really only be looking to do that second dive if you think it can end the game. So preferably you're only doing 1 dive a game or a second one if you think it's going to end the game and completely win it off. All right, but how are you really making this push? I told you when to go, but how are you going to make it happen? Because that's definitely important. First thing you need to do is if you are one of those brawlers who wants to make a dive in, you need to be saving your super for the dive. Of course, you rely completely on having your super to make the dive even possible. So you can't just be using it always to get kills. But if you do think you can get value with your super and get most of it back, of course, that's always a pretty good idea to do. The biggest thing with this strategy, though, is you honestly need to be really sneaky. So this is going to work better on some maps than others. For instance, bot drop, you can be really sneaky on the sides of the map, and it's actually kind of easy to do solo dives with this, although maybe it's a little bit hard to do duo dives. So try and use a lot of grass to your advantage. Make it so it's hard for the enemy to know exactly where you are. That way you can surprise them and make a sudden push on the enemy safe while they're out of position and they're not exactly sure that you're trying to make that dive on your safe. Or on their safe. But once you have that super, start hiding in the grass and wait for that opportunity for the enemy to get out of position, and then you can make that dive. Now the best tip I can give to make this even easier, although maybe it's a little unrealistic for a lot of you, is to be in voice chat with the person you want to dive with, or multiple people with their whole team. If you can communicate, of course, it's going to be a lot easier. Be like, hey, look, I want to dive really soon. Looks like they're out of position. Let's do it. And then you can both go in at the same time. It's really important for both of you or all 3 of you to go in at the exact same time because that Ike does so much damage. You want to make sure you're soaking up and tanking for each other as much as you can. Now, as I was saying, you really only want 2 people to be making that dive at the same time or else you can give up too much control. So what is that third brawler doing? That person who's not making the dive, what are they doing? They need to be focusing on staying alive and if they can, pushing the enemy back or at least holding them back, not pushing them back, and keeping as much control of the map as they can. Of course, they want to get bolts when they can, but it's most important for them to stay alive because it's going to be really hard for them to get control back. If they die with all 3 people, you're going to start getting spawn trapped if all of you die at that time. The third brawler also needs to be focusing on dealing damage to the enemy robo. You might find a good time to dive is when the enemy gets a robot because the enemy is going to start pushing forward, of course, with the robot. So maybe you dive while they push forward. So that third person needs to be making sure they're doing as much damage to that robot as possible because it's going to be hard to get it down quickly when it's just one person taking on the robot. But when should you not be making this dive? When is it better to just be going for bolts? When is it not a good idea to make that all-in push? Well, if your safe is around 50% health, you got to be really careful because if you're making that all-in dive, it's going to give that enemy control of the map and they're going to start getting more bolts. So if your safe is around 50% health, you need to be really careful and make sure you're not allowing the enemy to make a big push, which means you might want to consider just going for bolts and getting that robot and getting a bigger push that way instead of making that all-in dive. If you're making that all-in dive, it better be getting that enemy safe really close to being killed or getting it killed actually. As you start getting later into games, you need to be making sure you're going for bolts a little bit more unless you're gonna be able to make a dive that ends the game. But you're actually gonna find that this strategy has a nice positive effect once you make that first dive. First of all, once the enemy knows that you're going for dives, you're able to do that damage whenever you want, even without a robot, you're gonna start noticing that the enemy is a little bit more pushed back than they might normally be, because all of a sudden they're afraid that you might make that dive whenever. They know they have to be ready to be able to defend their safe, because you can go in and deal a ton of damage at a moment's notice if they're not ready. So you're gonna notice it's actually gonna be a little bit easier to get control of the map after you make that first dive. If you're playing a smart team anyways, that's gonna get a little bit more pushed back and be a little bit more cautious and realize we need to make sure that we're not allowing the enemy an easy push on our safe. So it might actually be a little bit easier to control the center of the map after you make that first big dive. So before we go over the best team comps and the best brawlers for diving, how viable is this strategy really? Is this gonna be something that's gonna be used everywhere all the time? Is it gonna be the best strategy overall in Siege? I don't think it's overpowered, but I do think it's a really good strategy that you need to know and you need to be aware of, because it does have that ability to get 50% or more damage on the enemy safe in one push, which is a really strong ability. So you definitely have to know about it and know how to defend it. The one thing with this is it is going to change your team comp. You're going to be going for brawlers that are better at diving potentially, and some brawlers might be better at controlling and maybe not as good at diving. So you're going to be facing situations, you're going to have strategies that are better at getting control of the map and making really big pushes with a robot versus strategies that are a little bit better at pushing without the robot, but maybe not as good at getting as many bolts, and you're not going to get as strong of a robot. So I think what's really going to end up happening is you're going to find more strategies that are a little bit more hybrid. You're going to end up with teams that have 2 brawlers that are really good at control and maybe 1 brawler that's really good at diving, and maybe they make smaller dives but still have the potential to dive at a moment's notice if you're not defending it well or if you're not paying attention. I do also think it's going to vary by the map. Some maps allow more sneaky activities, and that's definitely one of the big keys with this, is surprising the enemy and being sneaky and going behind them when they're not paying attention and when they're not able to defend it. So for the best brawlers for this, first of all, I think Bull is by far the best brawler at diving. When he supers in, he actually doesn't take damage from the Ike turret. He moves too fast. Bull can take damage while he supers, but he moves fast enough with his super that he actually misses the Ike shot. So he doesn't take damage until he stops moving, which is really good. And he does the most damage to that Ike by himself. So Bull is by far the best at diving. So I would really recommend you have a Bull. Other brawlers that complement Bull really well are also pretty decent at diving. El Primo is a really good option. Leon is an even better option, I think, just as far as he's better at control as well. Daryl's another decent option too. In general, what you're noticing is brawlers that have really quick movement speed, have the ability to get up the map at a moment's notice, are really good at diving, because of course they can just jump past the enemy really quickly and get on the enemy safe and deal as much damage as possible in a short amount of time. Now there are other brawlers that you can dive with that work well, as long as you have that Bull in front of them to tank for them. If you have that Bull in front of them, you can throw any brawler in front with that Bull. If they can make the dive with the Bull and not take much damage from the enemy, they can of course do even more damage to the enemy safe. So any long-range brawler that has the ability to just add more damage can be good as well, as long as they can get past the enemy unnoticed without taking too much damage. Anything like a Brock, a Colt, a Rico, even a Barley. As long as you save your super fort as well, do as much damage as possible, that can work pretty well too. It's not going to be quite as strong of a dive, but it can still work with it, and it can be a little bit better at control and still have the ability to make that dive. One thing to note though is turret users are not very good at making dives. You can throw that turret down, but you're really not going to be getting value back, and it's really not going to be quite as good. But what about how to stop dives? Of course you want to be able to dive on the enemy, but now that it's becoming more of a strategy, you also have to know how to stop them yourself. So first of all, you need to be really aware of the enemy positioning, but you also really need to know if they have their super. This strategy depends on the enemy having their super to make that dive even possible. You need to know that tank, that El Primo, that Bull, whoever it is that has the potential to make that dive, if they have their super or not. So when they have that super, watch out and keep an eye on them and how close they are to that red line, to that semicircle? Are they starting to get kind of close to it? Are they inching towards it? If they're starting to get close, they might be thinking about making that dive, and you need to be able to get back and defend at a moment's notice. So it's also nice to be able to have someone who's close to mid, but essentially who can shoot the middle of your turret at a moment's notice kind of easily. It's also really important to keep in mind your safe percentage. As your safe percentage starts getting kind of low, around 30% or under, or maybe even 40%, the enemy might start making dives to try and end the game. So you need to be really careful at those points. And maybe they weren't doing any dives before that, but once they get within that range, any team, any whatever can start making dives on your safe, and you need to be aware of that. So be really aware of the enemy positioning. If they're starting to get really close to your safe, they are gonna try and start making dives and try and end the game whenever they can. Of course, it's gonna give up some control, but if they also already know they're gonna lose the next robo, they're definitely gonna be going all in and try and make that dive. So whenever you see that, make sure you have someone who can at least shoot towards the middle of your Ike turret, because that's where they're gonna be. So you need to have someone who can shoot mid and at least put a little bit of damage on them. If you can put a little bit of damage on them, they will go down really quickly. Of course, the Ike turret does 2,000 damage per second, so it does get rid of enemies really quickly. If you can add a little bit of extra damage to that, it makes a big difference in how much damage the enemy does or doesn't do. Want to know how much damage each brawler can do in a solo dive? Check out that video right over there giving you that and a lot of other great Siege tips. That's gonna be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you later.